I think it's necessary to look a little bit further at the reasons why there was such a crisis in the House of Commons the other day. And it comes down to one particular part of the SNP motion, and that is the idea that Israel should be responsible for the collective punishment of Palestinians. And that's a war crime. Cutting off water, cutting off electricity is also a war crime, which Keir Starmer was prepared to acknowledge. But he wasn't prepared to acknowledge and hasn't been prepared to acknowledge the concept of collective punishment. And I find it really difficult to recognise anything other than the collective punishment of a people that is bombed to smithereens. Now, I'm absolutely in favour of a country defending itself, but I'm not in favour of a country that shows absolutely no principle towards the civilian population which is being bombarded. And in this case, there are two things that Israel could and should have done, even if it went ahead, which I think is foolish, even if it went ahead with the ground offensive on its own without the support and assistance, or indeed without the lead from allies. One is to open all the gates to medical emergencies and to put the hospitals and medical facilities of Israel at the disposal of the civilians from Gaza. In other words, to accept Gazan refugees. It hasn't done that. It's had every opportunity. And two is to systematically avoid targeting dense civilian areas, and particularly civilian areas which are geared towards medical support. Now, of course, what Israel says, almost certainly true, is Hamas is hiding in hospitals. Very clever of Hamas. But nevertheless, that decision to attack civilian areas and places of high civilian density where civilians are taking shelter is abhorrent. It is to take a view of collective punishment. The SNP is right. The SNP might be guided by the fact that Humzi Yousaf's wife is Palestinian, that his brother-in-law is a doctor risking his life in Gaza still, but the SNP is right. Is Labour right? Well, Labour is, of course, the party that was at the helm during the Iraq war crisis. Labour voted to go to war. And Labour under Keir Starmer have backed up the Conservative position to support Israel. It's perfectly possible to support Israel, but at the same time, we should be supporting the Palestinian people. We should be ensuring that the Palestinian people are not punished for the crimes of the Hamas terrorists. The Palestinians in Gaza have no choice but to be ruled by these thugs. I would call attention immediately to the LGBTQ people in Gaza, in Palestine, slaughtered. It's you're not going to be better off by being in Palestine, by being in Gaza, if you're LGBTQ, and you have no choice. A country which is ruled by people who give their civilians no choice is a tyranny, much like Putin's Russia. Incidentally, the same issue with LGBTQ+. And the vote that took place on what are we now? We're now Thursday. Are we Thursday? We're now Friday, Thursday, Wednesday. The vote that took place on Wednesday was one of those rare occasions when the SNP, as the third party in Parliament, was given the option of an opposition day. It should have been its day. And by convention, although the government is given an opportunity to put forward amendments, the Labour Party, even if it puts forward amendments, is not chosen. that means that that it would be a choice between the SNP proposition and the government amendment. In this case, it was a choice between the government amendment and the Labour amendment. In other words, the SNP no longer had a vote on its own
of this House
business.
And its ability to debate. And we also saw the worst of this House as it descended into farce. Last evening, we saw the best of this House and its ability to debate. And we also saw the worst of this House as it descended into farce. And I think I speak for everyone in the chamber just now, and indeed yesterday, when I expressed my deep sorrow that that was able to happen, given the content of what it was we were debating. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, it descended into farce because of a decision that you made, and you alone made, to ignore the advice that was given to you by the clerks. In doing so, on the opposition day of the Scottish National Party, my colleagues and I were denied the ability to vote on a matter.
This problem is then compounded by the fact that when you look at the amendment that Labour proposed, Labour put forward, it changed the word ceasefire to humanitarian ceasefire, which is a bit like humanitarian pause. Doesn't really mean anything, actually, adding the word humanitarian, but it steadfastly refused to accept the idea of collective punishment. Collective punishment is something that it did not want to charge Israel with, and that's the big difference between the Labour amendment and the SNP motion. The SNP motion actually was very sound. And I think the SNP motion works even if you, like me, support the principle of Israel to defend itself, support the principle of Israel as a good country in the Middle East, support the principle of Israel having been founded and endorsed by the UN. And I think it gets to the heart of the problem of the Netanyahu government. The SNP is right. The Labour Party is wrong. And the Conservative Party is wrong. But equally, this obsession with a ceasefire is I think, the wrong language to be using. A ceasefire, a capitulation to terrorism is inappropriate. What is needed is a permanent peace and a negotiation between Palestine and Israel, and if necessary, the eradication of Hamas. But I think at the present moment, the eradication of Hamas is now almost an impossibility. I think Netanyahu has effectively succeeded in turning this round so that Hamas is now a permanent part of the Israeli scene. That is a complete disaster. He hasn't got back the hostages, and he hasn't eradicated Hamas, and he's killed so many people. An utter disaster. It needs to be condemned. It needs to be condemned. And the fighting needs to stop. If we call it a ceasefire, we might, but I have never advocated for a ceasefire. I've always advocated for peace.
I can categorically tell you that I did not threaten the Speaker in any way whatsoever. I simply urged him to ensure that we had the broadest possible debate, so that actually the most important thing, which is what do we do about the awful situation in Gaza, could be properly discussed by MPs with a number of options in front of them. That's the right thing to do. The Speaker did the right thing in making sure the debate was broad. But the tragedy is the SNP walked off the pitch because they wanted to divide the Labour Party and they couldn't, and the government walked off
It's
the pitch
quite extraordinary.
because it thought it was going to lose.
And And then there's this story which was put forward by various people and supported by seasoned journalistic veterans like Nicholas Watt in BBC Newsnight, who said that there was a plot, an agreement to bring down the Speaker. If you don't help us, Mr. Speaker, you will be brought down by Labour after the general election. So the Speaker is more concerned with keeping his job than with protecting the principles of Parliament. To protect himself, the Speaker went along with breaking parliamentary protocol in a partisan parade of posture and a clear step towards chaos. The only way that the Parliament in the House of Commons in Britain functions is if there is a Speaker who is seen to be impartial. This Speaker, a former member of the Labour Party, has sided with the Labour Party, not against the Conservative Party, against another opposition party, against the SNP. That is abhorrent. So yes, of course, it pulls focus away from the real issue. But at the same time, it exposes the fragmentation not of the Conservative Party alone. And this is something I've been saying for a while. It's the fragmentation of Parliament. When the canker gnaws, it starts to eat away at the building blocks of the building itself. The cancer may have been brought in by the Conservatives, but it is gnawing away at every part of our parliamentary democracy. And the longer Rishi Sunak holds on to power, the longer this misery goes on, and it emerges all over the place. Because in the end, politicians, however well-intentioned they are, however idealistic they may be, are desperate to keep their own job because they don't have any choice. Because they don't have another job to go back to. A politician who has lost their job is a very poor individual, struggling, because who would give a politician a job, particularly an unpopular politician? It's really difficult. The Conservatives are busy, the Conservative members of Parliament who know that they're going to be defeated in the next election are busy running around the place looking for little sinecures and favours. That doesn't commend itself to probity, does it? The Labour people are probably pretty convinced they're going to get in the next election, but nevertheless, that smear of corruption becomes second nature. And yes, the Speaker and the Leader of the Opposition both denied that any conversations about pressure were applied at all. Of course they would.